Briefly, the news that came through early this morning was that the main road linking the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, with the rest of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass has now been cut. There are still apparently some country roads, smaller country roads, which allow exit and entry into these two towns, but the main road has been cut, and it is now difficult, increasingly difficult, to keep these troops supplied or to make it possible for them to retreat if such a decision to order them to retreat were ever made. At this moment in time, there is no sign that the Ukrainian government, that the political leadership of Ukraine is interested in a decision to order the troops in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk to retreat. In fact, the impression I'm getting, and this isn't just me, it's also been reported by the usual flood of commentators, bloggers, people like this that you find on both sides of this conflict. The impression is that the Ukrainian leadership is prepared to treat the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, allegedly 12,000 of them, though some have put it lower at 8,000 and others have put it higher at 20,000. I'm not going to guess which it is, that it's treating them in very much the same way as it treated the Ukrainian troops who were surrounded in Mariupol. In other words, they are being told to stand and fight and given promises, assurances that relief will one day come. And I hope is that they will go on fighting until, well, I'm not quite sure what, but at any rate until some kind of moral or other victory is achieved. Now, it isn't just Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, where the Ukrainian troops are facing a military crisis. Over the course of the last 3 days, there's been a major Russian assault on the Ukrainian town of Liman. As I understand it, from the rather confusing reports that are coming through from Liman, nearly all the city has now been captured by the Russians, except of course for various stragglers and people who are holding out in some of the residential buildings in the town. And apparently there's also a concentration of Ukrainian troops now gathered at the railway station who are also holding out as well. But pretty much everybody expects that Liman will be fully captured and come fully under Russian control within the next few hours or days at most. And there are further reports of more penny packets of Ukrainian troops surrounded elsewhere in northern Donbass, with the situation of the entire Ukrainian grouping in northern Donbass becoming increasingly difficult. There's also some reports that the Russians have now managed to cross the Severodonetsk River, something that they've been trying to do, of course, for several weeks. And the Ukrainian government, or at least members of the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian government rarely talks with one voice about military developments in Donbass. Anyway, an official of the Ukrainian government has apparently put the number of Russian troops in the Izium area, and this being the biggest concentration of Russian troops in the northern Donbass, and these are, by the way, Russian regular troops. This official has put them at 20,000, which does suggest a very substantial strike force indeed in terms of the overall fighting in Donbass. Now, elsewhere, I've also received further reports that more of those villages and settlements northeast of Kharkiv that fell back under Ukrainian control over the course of the Ukrainian counteroffensive that was so much talked about a few days ago, that another one of these settlements, important settlements, has now been recaptured by the Russians. Again, it seems that there is very little actual fighting in this area of northeast Kharkiv. What happened during that earlier counteroffensive is that the Russian troops, focusing as they were on the Donbass area, began a structured a withdrawal from some areas in northeast Kharkiv, largely because the main force of the Russian army was being concentrated in the battle in Donbass instead. And the Ukrainians took advantage of this to press, to carry out an advance in northeast Donbass, which the reduced forces that the Russians had deployed there wisely chose, it seems to me, not to try to resist, instead staging, as I said, a orderly withdrawal. Now, the Ukrainians apparently were hoping that this advance in northeast Kharkiv would cause the Russians to divert forces from the Donbass to try to hold ground in northeast Kharkiv. But that never happened, and as we see, instead, the Russians pressed home their attacks in Donbass, and the Ukrainians did not achieve anything of great strategic significance in northeast Kharkiv. Instead, as the situation in Donbass has deteriorated, it is the Ukrainians who are having to transfer troops from the Kharkiv, northeast Kharkiv region to Donbass, and that has enabled the Russians to quietly reoccupy some of the villages that they had withdrawn from a few weeks ago. So we have a swing backwards and forwards in northeast Kharkiv of little strategic significance, but one, of course, which perhaps does call into question some of the rather impassioned commentary about Ukrainian successes that we were hearing from some people in Ukraine, including President Zelensky himself, and also in the media in the West. Now, that, it seems to me, is a summary, a fair summary of the military situation. There's been another very important development today, one which, to my mind, gives us a clear indication of where this battle is now going, and where the next target of the Russian offensive will be in the after Donbass, northern Donbass, and central and southern Donbass are fully cleared by the Russian troops of Ukrainian troops, and of course always assuming that some kind of peace settlement isn't negotiated in the meantime, something which I have to say I still think is extremely unlikely. I think we now have ever clearer signs of where the next Russian objective would be. Firstly, the Russians have been issuing a whole series of statements, making a whole series of statements and a whole series of decisions, including giving out passports, Russian passports, in the city of Zaporozhye. And in fact, various statements made by Russian officials rather confirm my overall suspicions that Zaporozhye region, the entirety of Zaporozhye region, along with the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics and Kherson region, are ultimately slated for annexation or incorporation into Russia once this conflict is ended. And the Russians did something else yesterday, which to my mind strongly points in that direction. This is that for the first time, they launched missile strikes against the giant Motorsich factory located near the city of Zaporozhye itself. Now, Motorsich is one of the major industrial enterprises of first the Soviet Union and then of Ukraine. It made a very large proportion of the engines that were used by Russian ships, including Soviet ships, including Soviet warships. And by the way, until 2014, it continued to build most of the engines used by the warships of the Russian surface fleet. It also made helicopter engines, aircraft engines like those of the giant Antonov 124 transport aircraft, and also a whole lot of other civil aircraft made first by the Soviet Union and then by Russia and Ukraine. And of course, it also builds gas turbines, and it produces all kinds of other heavy industrial equipment, which were very much a part of the Soviet industrial and military economy. Now, up to now, the Russians have not launched attacks on Motosich. Now, the reason I suspect why they have not done so is because Motosich in recent years has attracted Chinese investment, and the Chinese have had technology agreements with the Motosich factory, and they've used Motosich technology and engines that ultimately derive from those built at Motosich, both within their own surface fleet. So I think for this reason, the Russians have been very wary about launching missile strikes against Motosich up to now. After all, China is Russia's most important political, military, and strategic ally. But something has happened which has caused that to change. Now, a few days ago, we heard further reports that the Russian and Chinese air forces had carried out another joint patrol over the Sea of Japan, Russian and Chinese aircraft carrying out a maritime patrol together, strongly suggesting that some kind of military cooperation between the Russians and the Chinese remains ongoing despite the conflict in Ukraine. And that, I think, has put to rest any idea that the conflict in Ukraine has created any kind of rift between Beijing and Moscow. But the fact that this aerial display, this joint air patrol involving Russian and Chinese bombers took place, I think this must have also been intended as a sign that the Russians and the Chinese have reached further consensus on a number of other areas. And I suspect there's been discussions between the Russians and the Chinese about Zaporozhye, and the Chinese have presumably made known to the Russians that whilst they're obviously not actively supporting any Russian missile strikes on Motosich or on Zaporozhye, the Chinese have remained studiously neutral throughout this conflict, at least in word, and I think to a great extent indeed. Nonetheless, the Chinese have probably also made clear to the Russians that if there is an attack on Zaporozhye, if there is an attack on Motosich, well, the Chinese will not see that as a provocation, as something that would cause them to rethink their relations with Russia. Most probably, the Russians have been able to reassure the Chinese that they are in a position now to replace any aircraft or ship engines that Motosich used to supply China, which, by the way, they probably can. And besides, with their enormous industrial capacity, I've no doubt that the Chinese themselves have long since surpassed any industrial and technological know-how that they relied Motosich to provide them with. So that has opened the way for the Russians, for the first time in this war, to attack and cause serious material damage to the Motosich plant. Now, that does have an effect on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, because there's no doubt at all that Motosich is an important part of Ukraine's remaining military-industrial complex. No doubt it's providing Ukraine with some components and systems that Ukraine still uses in its military operations, and its destruction or at least partial destruction, or at least the attack on it, will have reduced the extent to which the Ukrainians can rely on the industrial facilities that Motosic provides them. It must also, I suspect, be a psychological blow for Ukraine, because up to now, the Ukrainians themselves seem to have had lingering hopes that they would be able to talk the Chinese into exercising some kind of restraint on the Russians. There was even some talk at one point that the Ukrainians were looking to China to act as some kind of mediator between themselves and the Russians. Well, it must now be unequivocally clear to Ukraine that that isn't going to happen, that when it comes to a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, China unequivocally stands by its long-term relationship with Russia. It's not prepared, in other words, to take any step that will jeopardize that relationship. Well, the attack on Motosic, in my opinion, is not the last word on this. As I said, I'm confident that after Donbass is cleared, Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, one of the more important industrial centers of Ukraine, will be the next target as the Russians continue their operations to tidy up southeast Ukraine and to complete their land bridge to Crimea, the land bridge between Donbass and Crimea. And be under no mistake, the loss of Zaporozhye coming on top of the loss of Donbass, the loss of Mariupol, which is one of the centers of the Ukrainian steel industry, the loss of the coal mining regions of the Donbass, of the major industrial plants that was located in Donbass, and admittedly the perhaps economically less important but nonetheless very attractive region of Kherson, which provided the land bridge to Crimea. The loss of all of these regions will be a significant blow to Ukraine. I also understand that Zaporozhye region is agriculturally rich. I'm not absolutely sure that this is the case, but apparently it contains a significant part of Ukraine's famous Black Earth agricultural area. So its loss would be, as I said, an economic body blow to Ukraine, coming on top of all the other territorial losses that Ukraine has suffered from. Now, whilst all of these events are shaping out in Donbass, whilst, as I said, the Ukrainian army is suffering its major losses in Donbass, there continue to be suggestions. There is a significant amount of commentary about what Ukraine's overall strategic plan is, if it has one. And here I'm going to touch on certain views that have been widely expressed, but which have been most eloquently and eruditely articulated by Scott Ritter. And Scott Ritter and many others have said that what is happening is that the Ukrainians are resisting the Russians in Donbass. I hope I'm summarizing his views properly, that they're resisting the Russians in Donbass in order to buy themselves time to rebuild fresh armies in central and western Ukraine and in training areas in Poland and Germany, and to re-equip these new armies with Western weapons so as to go on to the counteroffensive in the late summer. And this is not, I should say straight away, a completely absurd view. On the contrary, it's an erudite view. And if this was the plan, it would be a rational plan. And I would say that it also finds support from some commentaries that have been made by Ukrainian officials themselves. The chief of Ukrainian military intelligence, for example, is saying that Ukraine will be ready to launch major counteroffensives against the Russians at the end of August. And President Zelensky's spokesman, Mr. Arestovich, has in effect said the same thing. So is this true? Now, let me repeat again. I don't have access to all the information coming out from Ukraine. I don't have details of exactly what is going on across Ukraine. I don't know what the plans in Russia are. I don't know much about many of these things. I don't have all the details. But I'm going to say one thing straight away. Well, two things straight away. Firstly, even if it was the case that this is a holding operation in Donbass to buy the Ukrainians the time they need to rebuild their armies in central and western Ukraine and to retrain and re-equip, perhaps in Poland and in Germany, I would say that even if that were the case, the cost to the Ukrainian army that is being paid seems to me to be completely exorbitant. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the body count issue. President Zelensky has said that Ukraine is losing around 100 men a day in Donbass, which to me seems like an awful lot. Others, I think more plausibly, put the numbers higher. The Russian Defense Ministry puts them higher still, into the several hundreds a day. There's clear signs that large amounts of equipment are being lost. On top of that, we've now seen 4,000 Ukrainian troops taken prisoner in Mariupol, and on the assumption that the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk grouping is eventually ground down and destroyed, well, it looks like there will be more casualties and thousands more prisoners taken there. And one gets the impression that the same fate ultimately awaits the remaining Ukrainian grouping in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which I've also heard suggestions that it probably numbers around 20,000. Now, these seem to me to be extremely high losses for a holding operation to buy time in order to rebuild these Ukrainian armies in central and western Donbass, central and western Ukraine. And I'm not even taking into account now the equipment losses, which seem to me to be even higher proportionately. Moreover, the military units that are being lost in the process seem to be amongst Ukraine's best. They seem to include a disproportionate number of paratroop airborne units, which presumably account for much of Ukraine's best infantry. The force that was lost in Mariupol included a Marine brigade, which is, again, I presume, one of Ukraine's best military formations. And one gets the sense that other units that have been lost across Donbass rather, are some of Ukraine's best troops. Again, that seems to be an extraordinary way of thing to do, to throw away your best troops in order to buy yourself time in that fashion. But lastly, and perhaps more crucially and more critically, I have to say, I see no real evidence that Ukraine is buying itself time by this sacrifice of these troops. All I could say is I follow reports from Ukraine closely. Obviously, I'm limited to English language reports, but these obviously discuss at length commentaries and discussions that take place in social media in Ukraine. And I see no real evidence of some great regrouping and retraining of large numbers of Ukrainian troops in central and western Ukraine, or indeed in Poland or in Germany. Even allowing for the probability of military censorship on over such a thing, in respect of such a thing. I would have thought that some discussion of the rebuilding of these of the Ukrainian army in central and western Ukraine would be taking place. Now, I have seen one thing which I have talked about in previous programs. I've noticed that Ukrainian forces that have been thrown into battle, the Ukrainian reinforcements that have been repeatedly sent to Donbass, which have engaged in battles there, especially with this very powerful Russian grouping around Izium. I've commented about the fact that the men who seem to make these units up, at least on the basis of the pictures of prisoners that I've seen, are getting older and older. Many of them now seem to be in their 40s, perhaps even older than this. And it has crossed my mind to wonder whether what is happening is that Ukraine is holding its younger, fitter men back as they're being trained, and is throwing into the battle its older and less fit men. That would be an incredibly ruthless and brutal and even cynical calculus, but it would, I suppose, in terms of war, be a rational one. Well, I have wondered whether that might be going on. But if that is indeed what is going on, then I would like to see some evidence of it. Perhaps it is, but I've seen no evidence of large numbers of Ukrainian troops being held back in reserve, being trained over the weeks and months that are needed to prepare them for battle. On the contrary, the impression I'm getting is that the Ukrainians are pulling together all the reserves they have, young men, older men still, training them in a hurry, giving them whatever weapons that can be found. And there's some rather disturbing stories of men being sent into battle without flak jackets, for example, and without adequate artillery cover and all of those things, and then hurled into the battle in Donbass, where, of course, many of them die. And there's now a mass of complaints and commentaries across Ukrainian social media of Ukrainian formations, military formations, the soldiers of these military formations coming along and complaining bitterly about the fact that they're being treated as cannon fodder. And by the way, that is the word that they themselves use about themselves. Now, in total fairness and in complete, to even this out, there's one report of one militia unit belonging to the Donetsk People's Republic making a not dissimilar complaint. They too complain about the heavy losses they suffered in Mariupol. They too make various complaints about the way they feel they've been treated by the authorities in Donetsk. Though I would say that they don't approach the anger and bitterness, and in some cases outright refusal to fight, that I'm getting from some of these Ukrainian commentaries. But obviously, one can't really set one case of complaints on the Donbass side to these multiples of complaints that are now coming from the Ukrainian side. So there's little evidence that I can see of this big Ukrainian retraining, regrouping in central or western Ukraine, or even, especially not in Poland and Germany. What about the re-equipment? Well, I think one of the things that has spooked many people is this US aid package for Ukraine of $40 billion. And many people are saying this is a huge amount of money. If Ukraine is provided with $40 billion worth of weapons, that will inundate Ukraine with fresh weapons, that will drown out the Russians, that will enable Ukraine to launch its great counteroffensives at the end of August. And we've seen that Ukrainian leaders, some Ukrainian leaders, are themselves talking in precisely that way. Again, the trouble is that when you actually study this package, when you unlock it, when you break it down, it suddenly begins to look a lot less impressive. In fact, it starts to look like a typical American aid package. It seems to have started with a desire to provide military equipment for Ukraine. But then, of course, always it goes through the budget process. And every American aid package always goes through this process. The various parts of the US bureaucracy, this vast, incoherent, disorganized, unstructured bureaucracy, each of them has their own say. Each of them latches onto this aid package, their own pet project. Each one of them wants to be involved, and eventually the budget grows, it swells, the amount of money involved swells as various departments of the US government chip in with their own ideas. And those ideas may not be very related to the situation in Ukraine itself. So we get, for example, vast allocations to the State Department and to various organizations and agencies run by the State Department. And we get money for humanitarian agencies, for refugees, for NGOs, the various NGOs. We get various departments of the US government all chipping in, getting money through this aid package, which they know is going to go through Congress, and it is their opportunity to thereby get funding which they might be looking for, but which they might feel they might have difficulty getting in some other way. And then, of course, this already swollen package finds its way to Congress, and then every single congressman and representative and senator chips in with his own ideas, and that inflates the thing even further. Now, I've looked at this aid package. It's always easy to get a clear sense of these things, but I reckon that instead of $40 billion of military aid for Ukraine, which is what I think many people think this aid package amounts to, my own estimate, which is the one which I've seen other people also come up with, is that it's more like $6 billion. And it's not $6 billion of weapons. It's $6 billion of weapons and training. So less than $6 billion of weapons. And of course, when it comes to training, it's important to say that there is absolutely nothing new about this. The US military and various Western militaries have been busy training the Ukrainian army ever since the 2014 Maidan coup, revolution, change of power, call it what you will. So this is already far less impressive than it looks. Bear in mind also the inordinate cost of much of the weaponry that the United States provides. Now, let's take an example of the M777 howitzers that we've been hearing so much about. I mean, these use digital sighting systems, and by the way, contrary to some reports, I believe that some of the howitzers that have been supplied to Ukraine do indeed have those digital sighting systems. But the thing that really stood out for me is that they not only use these digital sighting systems, but of course they use special ammunition in order to, special extended range ammunition, which is very expensive. But they also use large numbers of titanium. They use a certain amount of titanium in their subcomponents. Now that is extremely expensive. That is going to add inordinately to the cost of what is, after all, supposed to be a simple example of towed artillery. I can't help but think that it is a disproportionate cost relative to whatever benefit in lightness it provides. And I understand that titanium anyway makes these guns more brittle, these howitzers more brittle, and therefore increases the maintenance burden. Moreover, there's aspects of these howitzers which make them apparently difficult to use. I was reading a Russian report, I should say perhaps an informal Russian report, but apparently it circulates information that has been spreading through the Russian military after the first encounter with these howitzers, which is that the slated rate of fire of 8 rounds a minute is not being achieved. More like 4 rounds a minute at the start is perhaps closer to what the Ukrainians are achieving, and that falls to 1 to 2 rounds a minute after extended use. And that's probably because Ukrainian troops have been trained in such a hurry that they're not able to keep up these rates of fire. But it's also because, according to the Russians, these howitzers are anyway not really intended or designed for extended saturation shelling. On the scale that is happening in Donbass, somebody suggested they're more like a sniper gun than the kind of heavy artillery, lobbing masses of shells in the way that the Russians have. So that $6 billion, or perhaps it's less than that in terms of weapons, might not actually extend very far in terms of the numbers of weapons that it actually provides. And of course, it may be that the weapons that are provided are not rugged enough for these conditions, the Ukrainian conditions, and are not really suitable for Ukrainian troops to use in this kind of battle. And that certainly seems to be true of other weapon systems as well. I mean, the Javelin systems, many people have commented upon the fact that they have not proved as effective as expected. I can't help but wonder whether part of the reason for this is that Ukrainian troops just have not had the time to familiarize themselves and train with these weapons to anything like the necessary level to use them effectively, and that the cost and time needed to train those troops to that sort of level makes it impractical to supply them with these weapons at all. So I'm skeptical, to say that, to put it straightforwardly, that there is this major mobilization in the rear going on in Ukraine, and I'm skeptical about these American aid packages. I think that both the build up in the rear is something of a mirage. It's something that's been talked about, but which up to now I've seen no evidence of. And as for the military supplies from the United States, I think that people are reading too much into these bloated numbers that we now so commonly get from the United States. But there is another factor as well, which is the last one which I'm going to mention in connection with this, and that is the factor of the training of Ukrainian troops in Poland and Germany. I'm going to say straight away that I think that if word gets out that large numbers of Ukrainian troops are being trained in Poland and in Germany, over time, that is going to cause increasing alarm and disquiet amongst the European public. It's going to be seen as something that threatens the extension of the war into Central Europe. And already we're seeing that the European public in many places in Europe is now starting to have serious doubts about the war. In Greece and Bulgaria, two countries historically friendly to Russia, public opinion has shifted from a pro-Ukrainian stance at the start of this conflict to one more sympathetic to Russia and more hostile to the war. And I suspect that this is going to be the case in other places as well, in Slovenia, Croatia, probably Slovakia, perhaps even the Czech Republic before long. And I'm not going to even start with places like Hungary, for example. And I think that in Germany too, there are signs of increasing doubts and worries. And I think that if people in Germany start learning that there's large numbers of Ukrainian troops being trained on German soil, and I want to say straight away that up to now I've seen no evidence of this happening, but if word gets out that that is the case, then I think you're going to see German concerns, which of course are already rising because of the economic costs. I think you're going to see those German concerns grow. So I'm not sure that these concerns that people have, which, let's be clear, are not wild or fanciful concerns, but I'm not convinced that these concerns have any real reality. I'm going to say straight away that the Russians seem themselves to be extremely calm about all of this. They don't seem to be afraid that Ukraine is building up large forces in central or western Ukraine. They don't seem to be anticipating any really successful Ukrainian counteroffensives anywhere in any of the territory that they've occupied. They don't seem to be worried, especially, about this vast flood of weapons that is supposed to be heading in Ukraine's direction. They continue to work incrementally and methodically, destroying the Ukrainian army in Donbass. I think they are confident that once that is done, that will give them a winning hand in the rest of the war. Now, the standard Russian doctrine of operations, developed in the 1920s all the way back to the 1920s by various Soviet military theorists. The name that always gets mentioned is Vladimir Triandafilov, is so-called deep operations. You first do what the Russians are currently doing in Donbass. You use combined forces to smash, to break his front lines, to crack open the front lines, to destroy the armies, the enemy army that is facing you in the front lines. And once you destroy the enemy's army in that way, you then launch your armored forces into an offensive, a long offensive, deep into the enemy's rear, with a view to paralyzing the enemy and eventually destroying him. I'm probably not summarizing deep operations theory, Soviet and Russian deep operations theory, with any great skill or precision, but then of course I'm not a military person. But anyway, that seems to me the overall doctrine of Russian war fighting, at least historically. Perhaps that is what the Russians intend to do. Perhaps once they've defeated and destroyed the Ukrainian army in Donbass, we will see some great Russian armored offensive, most probably or presumably into central Ukraine, targeted through these wide open spaces, these places that are far less inhabited in central Ukraine, which perhaps are ideal territory for a major armored thrust. That would, of course, disrupt Ukrainian communications, cut off Kiev, paralyze Ukrainian forces, perhaps deal the knockout blow. I'm not going to speculate. I think Zaporozhye, as I said, is probably the first objective. But regardless, nothing that I'm seeing so far, and I'm talking about actual facts on the ground, lead me to think that these concerns about Ukrainian counteroffensives in late August, about a big Ukrainian build-up over the next weeks and months, nothing that I've seen up to this point leads me to think that any of that is actually happening or going to happen. Of course, things may change. Decisions may be made in the United States and Europe that could change this picture. And on the contrary, as I've said in my previous program, it seems to me that all the indications up to now is that the doubts instead are growing. Well, there we are. That's me for the day. That's all I'm going to say about the situation as it is working out at the moment. That's all I'm going to say. More from me soon. And in the meantime, thank you for joining me on this program. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, Rumble and Locals especially. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop, buy the amazing things that you will find there. And of course, if you've liked this video, please remember to check your subscription and also to tick the like button. Thank you very much for joining me again today. More from me soon.